I'm not sure that I can pinpoint the exact academic reference to it, but it's been attributed to Hippocrates, this statement: no brain injury is too severe to despair of, nor too trivial to ignore. That statement, no brain injury is too severe or too trivial, is the context of what I would call the miracles and the tragedies. The miracles in the severe cases and the tragedies in the mild. In the emergency room at the hospital, you have two very wide spectrums of brain injury. You have the coma cases, representing perhaps 50,000 comas a year in the United States. In contrast, there's probably 500,000 to 1 million concussions a year in the United States. The comas, of course, get all the medical interventions. They get the helicopter rides. They get the immediate CT scans. They get all of the medical personnel running around like you'd see on a television show. In contrast, the concussion case may not even have anyone in the emergency room even figure out that there was a concussion, because you don't get to the emergency room for 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, until after you've actually had the accident. So by the time you get to the emergency room, the only symptom may be a neck injury or a neck pain or a headache, often nausea, which is more significant than it is often attributed to be, because it's often a sign of some type of vestibular problem going on or a significant concussion. So what you have is this very severe injury versus the one that may be so non-severe that it doesn't even get noticed. So you know, seemingly fully functioning person, completely unable to function, completely comatose. What happens bizarrely is these two types of cases tend to get more and more alike the further out from outcome you get. Of course, there are a significant number of people who have a coma who die. But those who wake up from a coma, very often, 6 months or a year, seem to have a complete miracle. Everybody who sat in the waiting room and held the hand has prayed to God that this person wakes up. And when they do, after a week or two or a month or however long it takes to get their feet back on the ground and to feel at least somewhat acclimated to the world again, it is often very surprising to the person who hasn't seen the process how normal they seem. If you hear somebody's been in a coma and a severe brain injury, that initial reaction is you're going to run into a person who's nearly some sort of profound retardation. And it's amazing how often people see this person and say, wow, this is really a miracle. In contrast, we have the person with a concussion who 24 hours is worse off than they were an hour after the accident, who a week later tries to go back to work, has problems, a month later is having further personal problems, starting to notice problems with their memory, problems with simple cognitive tasks, thinking tasks. And 6 months or a year later, their life is a complete mess. And these two very, very different at the onset injuries are converging. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is the concussion is obviously more serious than we realized. And the reason we're not realizing how serious it is, we're only judging the aspect of the concussion that relates to being alert, having the ability to currently feedback information. But the other aspect of it is that the concussion injury actually does get worse over time for a number of reasons. The first is that there actually is a neuropathological process going on that the axons, which are the wires that connect each neuron indirectly to each other, over a period of the first 72 hours, go from strained to damaged to dead. So where there may be still a transmitting axon at the emergency room period of time, by 3 days later, that axon is now dead. There are also other secondary type of injuries that occur. There could be a swelling mechanism that's going on that isn't severe enough to put a person in a coma, isn't severe enough to give these obvious neurological signs that there's increase in intracranial pressure, but that could be going on just subclinical, just below the level that's obvious, but still there and subtle. The other thing that could be going on, and this is probably why we get as much convergence as we do, is that portions of the brain that do not affect the things that we can test in the emergency room have been injured. First, again, they don't typically test an amnesia type memory test where you can ask somebody about what was happening a half an hour ago, or coming back 24 hours later and asking them about the memories that they have been able to absorb in the last 24 hours. But there's also parts of the brain that can be very, very badly injured, and it doesn't show up in the kind of evaluation we do. There's an area of the brain right above your nose where the olfactory nerve comes directly into the brain that is a terribly, terribly important part of the brain. It's called the orbital frontal area of the brain. That part of the brain is essentially the conductor of the symphony. That part of the brain tells the musicians when to play, tells the symphony of your body, the symphony of your mind, what to do, when to do it, and to start. It takes a very small injury to that part of the brain before you start to have very, very serious problems with initiation, with motivation, and with decision making. Take the example. What is perhaps the most common denominator among people with a significant brain injury in terms of their behavioral changes afterward? Simply the matter of making a decision. A trip to a grocery store is perhaps the most traumatic thing they can go through because there is so many different decisions that have to be made. One of the stories that's often told at brain injury seminars is the person who goes to the grocery store and can't decide what cereal to buy, so buys them all, or sees something that's on sale and buys 500 packages of something that they would only need 5 in a year. Trouble making decisions, making poor decisions. It's two different parts of the brain, but are often a similar symptom that will occur to people. Anytime you have to make a choice, it's very difficult. When we look at the people with the apparent miracles, the miracle is only on the surface. If you actually talk to the families, if you watch them behave, if you see how they interact, there are going to be changes. You cannot have the kind of brain injury that involves extended coma without very serious brain damage. Now, it may not be the kind of brain damage that will completely disable them, and we have done a very good job in this country of minimizing severe brain damage and also of reintegrating people with brain damage into the community. Perhaps because severe brain damage tends to be more focal, we know exactly what parts of the brain we have to retrain. So often it's a speech problem, so often it's a movement problem. These kind of things, we've got specialists who work in this area who worked with severe brain injury people their whole career and do a great job. What we don't have is specialists who work with someone with a subtle brain injury, someone who's part of that concussion group that doesn't have the good outcome, doesn't have the apparent full recovery. I suppose there's no money in it, but also it's very, very difficult to suddenly become the decision maker for an adult. This is why it's so important in our cases that we address the cost of life care, because life care is not just dealing with a person's toiletry and making sure they get fed. Life care is helping that person adapt through the losses they have, and when the loss is the decision making, the maturity of an adult, the drive and ambition to reintegrate themselves into the world, that's a terribly, terribly serious problem and really can only be addressed by providing for another human being to help them make those choices. What we have, two very different types of injuries apparently on the surface, but the common denominator is often the injury in the frontal lobes, where everything else on the severe side tends to get better. And the mild brain injury, that frontal lobe injury, is the predominant one that makes it so much more severe than it's realized. And what you have is 6 months or a year. These two population groups are surprisingly similar. It's a miracle for the person with the severe life-threatening injury. it's a real tragedy for the person who no one thought was severely enough hurt to even provide any interventions or warnings at the time of the injury.